The intelligent one is your brother. Your purpose is to assist, not to lead. The sophisticated meeting room was pierced like a razor by my father's words. Every sound is intended to serve as a reminder of my position within the family hierarchy. As he continued to make his statement to the gathered board members and family, I sat there in shock. Nathan will receive my mother's $50 million trust fund and take over Brit Holdings. I'm Juliet Whitmore, and I'm 32 years old. I've been under my younger brother's shadow for as long as I can remember. Nathan was praised for every substandard accomplishment, while I was supposed to remain silent, smile, and offer encouragement. However, there was something odd about this moment. This was more than just a typical family meal where the father showered his golden child with love. My entire future was being given away in this way. The only sound in the mahogany-paneled room was the court reporter's pen scratching softly. As the board members congratulated him, Nathan sat up higher in his chair and grinned smugly. In Richard Whitmore's view, the heir was a parent who could do no wrong, and at 29, he had always been his father's favorite. I saw him shake hands with our father, who was grinning contentedly. Dad said, scarcely looking at me, "Juliet will continue in her current supportive role. She's always been good at the details, the behind-the-scenes work. She belongs there." I made myself applaud courteously, but the sound was hollow in my ears. Board members around the table nodded in agreement, as though this result had been predetermined. Some completely avoided looking at me, while others smiled sympathetically, which just made the humiliation worse. Nathan was already talking about his vision for the company, his voice full of the confidence that comes from never having to prove himself, but something flickered in the back of the room, a movement that briefly caught my attention before I returned my attention to the family celebration taking place in front of me. He gestured widely and said, "I plan to expand our operation significantly. We need to think bigger, take more risks." I bit my tongue, recalling all the times his risk-taking had almost cost us big contracts, but bringing that up now would only validate Dad's opinion of me as a meticulous supporter rather than a visionary leader. With my hands folded in my lap, I watched my brother accept an inheritance that should have been earned rather than given. I had no idea how drastically the afternoon would change, but I had a bad feeling in my chest that this moment would define everything that came next. Dad, Richard Whitmore, had transformed Brit Holdings from a modest consulting firm into a regional powerhouse, and he commanded both the company and our family with the same iron fist, so growing up in the Whitmore household meant learning early on that opinions were not equally respected. Dad raised Nathan and me in accordance with his strict views about gender roles and family hierarchy after my mother, Patricia, passed away when I was 15. Nathan has a natural aptitude for business, and Dad would tell anybody who listened that he thinks like an entrepreneur. It didn't matter that Nathan barely made it through business school with AC average, that I had spent the last 8 years working my way up through every department of our company, learning the business from the ground up, or that Juliet is methodical, cautious, and ideal for supporting roles. I wasn't blind to the irony that, while Nathan went to networking events and played golf with prospective clients, I was the one who really kept the business going. What mattered was that Nathan was the son, the chosen one, and I was just the daughter who happened to be excellent with spreadsheets. I examined every significant contract, identified accounting mistakes that could have cost us millions, and discreetly resolved issues brought about by Nathan's visionary thinking. I was the one who worked through 3 weekends to save the Henderson Group's business when they were on the verge of canceling their account due to Nathan's unrealistic deadline promises. Dad never saw any of that. Instead, he only saw Nathan's charisma, his ability to command a room, and his willingness to take risks without getting bogged down in pointless details. I created the restructuring plan that turned his aggressive expansion into the Phoenix market profitable. Grandmother Ella Lehner had been different. Even before her death 6 months ago, she had asked pointed questions about the business, wanting to understand not just the vision but the execution. Dad was blind to the fact that those details were frequently the difference between success and disaster. "You have your grandmother's mind for business," she had told me during our last conversation. "She built the foundation that your father expanded upon." Unlike Dad, she seemed genuinely interested in my perspective. She would corner me at family dinners, asking about specific projects and listening intently as I explained the challenges we were facing. Never forget that, Juliet. As Nathan went on to describe his ambitions for the business, I thought about those words. His ideas were definitely daring, but they lacked the meticulous analysis that had made Brit Holdings successful. The board members nodded along, but I could see the worry in some of their eyes as he talked about doubling our workforce in 2 years, entering 3 new markets at once, and making significant investments in technology that he obviously didn't comprehend. None of these intelligent, business-savvy individuals would question the heir apparent, certainly not in front of his father, even though they could hear the same danger signs that were ringing in my brain. As Nathan relished his moment of victory, I noticed a tiny disturbance in the back of the room once more, but when I turned to look, all I saw were the familiar faces of our family lawyer and her assistant. The shame descended upon me like a familiar weight. It wasn't the first time I'd been pushed to the sidelines while he claimed credit and recognition, but it felt like the most definitive, $50 million in control of a company I knew better than anyone, given to someone whose greatest business accomplishment was not totally dismantling the departments I had established. The words hurt because they reduced 8 years of my career to a supporting role in his story. I want to thank my father for believing in me, Nathan said, his voice carrying that practiced sincerity he had perfected over the years. And of course, my sister Juliet, for all her support. I know I can count on her to help me implement my vision. I saw the faces of people I had worked with around the table, people who recognized exactly how much I contributed to the company's success, even though I had always known this day would come. Dad went on, Juliet has always been the detail person, in a tone that seemed to be a compliment. And yet, not one of them would speak up. Corporate politics were more powerful than the truth. I wanted to remind Nathan about the Morrison account, where my attention to detail found a contract loophole that saved us $3 million, or the restructuring of our Denver office that I designed, which reduced overhead and increased productivity by 30%. She'll make sure everything goes smoothly while Nathan concentrates on the big picture. But refuting my father's story would only confirm his assertion that I was unfit for leadership, so I just nodded and grinned, fulfilling the role I had been given since I was a young boy. I'm excited to support Nathan's vision, I replied, my words tasting like ash on my lips. Nathan went over and gave me a shoulder squeeze, which was probably intended to be a brotherly gesture but felt more like a reminder of his authority because the firm is so important to our family. He said, that's what I love about Juliet. She's always been a team player. As if I hadn't been carrying the team for years while he took the credit. As if my ideas and innovations were just team playing instead of leadership. The casual dismissal was almost worse than Dad's outright rejection of my abilities. Well, I think that concludes our business for today, Dad said as he got up to terminate the meeting. Nathan, let's talk about the transition timeline. I noticed activity in the rear corner once more as folks started to gather their papers and get ready to depart. Victoria Collins, our family lawyer, was standing close to the door with what appeared to be a formal paper in her hands. She had a serious, almost gloomy, expression and appeared to be waiting for something. I couldn't quite put my finger on why, but the sensation of dread in my gut grew. As Dad and Nathan started talking about transition arrangements, Victoria Collins cleared her throat loudly from the back of the room. Excuse me, she said, her voice carrying the authority that came from 30 years of legal practice. Hadn't the worst already happened? The audience grew silent. There's something important that needs to be addressed before we conclude. Victoria had been our family's lawyer since before I was born, handling everything from estate planning to corporate contracts. Victoria, what's this about? The formal document in her hands indicated that this was no small administrative problem, and she was not one to casually disrupt meetings. Dad asked, his tone shifting from celebratory to concerned. Can it wait? In reference to the inheritance announcement you just made, Richard Victoria interrupted, saying, we're in the middle of it. I'm afraid it cannot wait, something she had never done in all the years I had known her. Nathan's self-assured smile wavered. "What do you mean?" he questioned, raising his voice above normal. "Everything's settled. Grandmother's will was read 6 months ago." Victoria approached the front of the room with methodical precision, her heels clicking against the glossy floor. I felt my heart rate quicken, but I couldn't figure out why. "That's right, Nathan." Every board member was watching now, sensing that something important was about to happen. Victoria remarked, setting the document on the conference table, "Your grandmother's original will was read 6 months ago, but it wasn't her final will." The words hung in the air like a ticking time bomb. "I don't understand," Dad replied slowly as the board members around the table exchanged baffled looks. Dad's face had turned pale, and Nathan was staring at Victoria as if she had spoken in a foreign language. "Years ago, Mother's will was settled. She was very open about her goals. Your mother amended her will 3 weeks before her death," Victoria declared in a calm and collected tone. "On January 15th, 2 days after Grandmother Eleanor had come to the office to go over our quarterly reports, she came to my office and performed a coddle that drastically altered the inheritance structure." I felt the room spin around me. I had believed it was just her typical meticulous approach to comprehending the business, but she had spent hours poring through our financial accounts and asking specific questions about the performance of each department. Nathan's voice cracked slightly as he continued, "That's impossible. She would have told us. She would have told Dad." Eleanor Whitmore's directions were quite detailed, and Victoria opened the document with great caution. In order to get the most accurate picture of how the family really felt about both possible heirs, she wanted the altered will to be sealed until the day the inheritance was formally disclosed to the corporation. The understanding struck me like a blow to the body. Grandmother had been putting us to the test by monitoring how Dad treated Nathan and me, noting our genuine contributions to the company, and basing her choice on what she saw rather than what she was told. What is stated in the amendment? For the first time since coming into the room, Victoria looked straight at me as Dad requested, even though it seemed like he already feared the response. The hush that ensued was so intense that I could hear my own heartbeat. "The modification gives Juliet Whitmore a controlling interest in Brit Holdings and names her as the principal beneficiary of the $50 million trust fund." Dad was staring at Victoria as if she had just declared that gravity had stopped working, and Nathan's face had turned pale to ashen. Board members around the table were taking in this information with the cautious attention of those who realized that everything they had previously believed had suddenly changed. Nathan said, "There must be some error," but even he seemed to know that Victoria Collins didn't make mistakes about legal documents. I sat motionless in my chair, unable to comprehend what I had just heard. Victoria continued reading from the page, her voice piercing the astonished stillness. "After 32 years of being told I wasn't smart enough, wasn't leadership material, and wasn't the appropriate choice, the one person whose opinion had built this corporation had picked me. According to Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore's updated will, I have concluded that Juliet has the business acumen, attention to detail, and strategic thinking necessary to lead the company into the future after carefully observing both my grandchildren's contributions to Brit Holdings." Nathan, a golden lad who had never been refused anything in his life, was hearing for the first time that he was lacking, and his mouth opened and closed like a fish struggling to breathe. "Continue reading," I heard myself say, my voice sounding alien to my own ears, and Victoria nodded in agreement. Meanwhile, Dad had sunk into his chair as if the weight of this knowledge was physically crushing him. The Henderson Group contract crisis, the failed Phoenix expansion strategy, and the near bankruptcy of our Denver office under his supervision have convinced me that leadership requires more than personality and good intentions, even though Nathan exhibits enthusiasm and charisma. His decision-making has shown a pattern of costly errors that could jeopardize the company's future. Grandmother had been keeping score, watching more intently than any of us suspected, and every item Victoria cited was a meticulously documented failure that I had discreetly remedied. The Phoenix expansion that lost money for 8 months and the Henderson contract that Nathan had almost lost due to unrealistic promises, which I had saved by renegotiating terms and working 3 weekends in a row, while Nathan was claiming credit for his audacious leadership. I had identified the issues and put solutions in place during the Denver office crisis that could have killed us. I had created the restructuring plan that made it profitable. Additionally, Victoria added, on my last visit to the offices, I noticed that staff members regularly looked to Juliet for advice on complicated issues, whereas Nathan's involvement usually required further clarification or correction. Regardless of formal titles or familial expectations, this pattern indicates that Juliet already holds the position of operational leadership inside the organization. I remembered the day my grandma had visited the offices back in January. She had shown up without warning, saying she was more interested in seeing how things actually operated than in receiving a polished presentation. The number of individuals she met with and the number of questions she posed regarding day-to-day operations startled me. I saw now that she had been performing an assessment. This is crazy. Nathan's well-held serenity eventually broke, and he exploded. I am the one who has been prepared for this role. Dad picked me. A last-minute document won't allow you to simply alter everything. Victoria calmly responded, the document is legally binding. Your grandmother was of sound mind when she made these modifications to her will, and she had every right to do so. In addition to the video evidence she produced outlining her reasoning, I have the medical records proving her mental competency. Finally, Dad was able to speak, albeit in a hoarse whisper. Her testimony was captured on video. Yes, she did. Ella Lehner wanted to make sure that her motivations and objectives could not be questioned. She devoted a significant amount of effort to recording the particular business choices and results that shaped her ultimate decision. It seemed as though the room was rotating on its own axis. All of Nathan and Dad's presumptions about our family, their beliefs about the future, and their plans were all collapsing in real time. It was evident in their expressions. The growing awareness that grandmother Eleanor had been observing, assessing, and finally rejecting the story they had created around Nathan's unavoidable succession. I leave control of Brit Holdings to Juliet because she has already demonstrated the leadership qualities necessary for the company's continued success. She has been leading without the title, Victoria concluded. The silence that followed. Victoria's last words was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was the sound of everything Nathan and Dad believed about themselves, about our family, and about the natural order of things collapsing all at once. Now she will have both the authority and the responsibility that her contributions have earned. The first to respond was Nathan, who stood up so quickly that his chair rolled back and hit the wall. This is ridiculous, he shouted, raising his voice to a level I hadn't heard since we were kids. I've been preparing for this my entire life, he said. Nathan, Victoria firmly stated, your grandmother was not manipulated. She spent months observing the business operations before making her decision. Everyone knows I'm the heir. You can't just change that because of some last-minute manipulation. When Dad finally spoke, his voice hollow, it wasn't impulsive, rather, it was the outcome of meticulous analysis. When did Mother begin to suspect Nathan? Victoria looked over her notes. My records show that Eleanor first asked for a review of her estate plan in September, almost a month after the Henderson Group disaster, stating that she wished to re-evaluate the accuracy of her initial succession assumptions. Nathan had assured a client that we could complete a thorough market analysis in 2 weeks, a project that normally required 6 weeks, during the Henderson Group crisis. Dad had complimented Nathan on his aggressiveness and creative thinking when the customer threatened to terminate their contract, but he was unaware that I had spent every night for 2 weeks developing a modified analysis that met the client's deadline while upholding our quality standards. Dad muttered, she never said anything. She made no indication that she was changing her mind. Eleanor asked for prudence in particular. Her goal was to see how the family interacted without trying to change their behavior. She believed that disclosing her plans to change her mind would undermine the validity of her assessment. I reflected on all the family meals we had shared over the previous few months and all the times my grandma had questioned me in depth about my job. I thought she was merely chatting as Dad and Nathan talked about Nathan's plans, but now I see that she had been doing job interviews. With his hands balled into fists, Nathan started to pace the entire length of the room. There must be a way to challenge this excessive influence, mental incapacity, or something. After decades, people don't just change their attitudes on inheritance. Victoria answered, they do when they learn new information. Eleanor provided a wealth of documentation. She documented certain business choices, their results, and the people who were ultimately accountable for both the successes and the failures. She saw a very obvious trend. Which pattern? Dad asked, but it was clear from his tone that he was starting to get it. Victoria gave me a direct look before responding. While Nathan was given credit for his leadership, Juliet was constantly in charge of resolving issues, averting catastrophes, and guaranteeing the real success of the business. Ella Lehner concluded that effective leadership was already taking place. It was simply not being acknowledged or rewarded. The room was physically struck by the sincerity of those statements. This dynamic had been observed by every board member in attendance. They had witnessed me discreetly manage the implementation while Nathan made audacious declarations. They had seen me working late into the night to make Nathan's visions a reality and had been present at meetings when his vision was praised. Additionally, Eleanor was especially worried about Nathan's financial forecasts for future growth, Victoria added. She had your CFO examine his suggestions on her own and concluded that they were, in her opinion, poorly researched and dangerously optimistic. I recalled those suggestions. Nathan intended to invest in technological systems that would cost more than our yearly profit, increase our staff in 18 months, and simultaneously enter 4 new markets. Dad had disregarded my worries as typical Juliet overthinking when I had discreetly told him about them. Grandma, however, had been paying attention. Victoria took out another document from her briefcase. One more thing, she said. Additionally, Eleanor left detailed instructions for the handover of power. Nathan halted his pacing and fixed his gaze on her. What sort of directions? She knew the family would be shocked by this disclosure. She wanted to make sure that there would be as little disturbance to business operations as possible and that the changeover would be professional and seamless. The second paper was opened by Victoria. Juliet takes over as Brit Holdings CEO with immediate effect. Nathan will continue to report directly to Juliet in his present role as Director of Business Development. The room exploded. As Nathan came to terms with the fact that he would suddenly be working for the sister he had always seen as his subordinate, his face flushed. Dad appeared to be struggling to breathe, his meticulously crafted worldview disintegrating in front of his eyes. "This is insane," exclaimed Nathan. "I will neither report to someone who has been my assistant, nor will I work for her." For the first time since Victoria had started reading, I whispered, "I was never your assistant. I was cleaning up your mistakes." The straightforward reality of that remark stopped him more successfully than any yell could have. Eleanor has also set up a mechanism for performance reviews, and board members were nodding slightly around the table, finally acknowledging what they had all known but never spoken out loud. Victoria kept reading. As assessed by Juliet and the board of directors, Nathan's employment and any future profit sharing will be contingent upon his ability to make better decisions and collaborate with others. Collaborative skills? Nathan's voice broke. For the first time since this meeting started, I stood up and said, "She's my sister, not my boss. Actually, I am both. Your first collaborative challenge will be explaining to the Henderson Group why your promised delivery timeline nearly cost us their contract." Finally finding his voice, Dad said, "Juliet, surely you don't intend to actually hold my brother accountable for his decisions?" I cut him off, saying, "Yes, Dad, I absolutely do," beginning with a thorough analysis of every project he has overseen over the previous 2 years. For the first time in his life, Nathan was facing the repercussions of his deeds rather than having them discreetly cleaned up by someone else, and the destruction on his face was almost gratifying. "The board will need time to process this information," remarked Margaret Chen, our longest-serving board member. Dad looked equally stunned, finally confronting the reality that his assessment of our capabilities had been not just wrong but dangerously misguided. James Park, our chief financial officer, continued, "But I think it's important to note that this transition actually formalizes what many of us have observed for years." Other board members started nodding in agreement. "Juliet has been the operational backbone of this company. You're all simply going to accept this?" Nathan looked around the room urgently, looking for support that was obviously not coming. "This decision acknowledges the reality that already exists rather than inventing a new one." I asked, my voice firm despite the rush of adrenaline, "Nathan, name one successful project you've completed without my involvement." "You're going to let her destroy everything we've built? What have we built?" After a long period of uncomfortable quiet during which Nathan struggled to answer, he turned to face his father with beseeching eyes and asked, "Are you going to let her talk to me like this?" Dad appeared older than I had ever seen him, evidently overwhelmed by his own miscalculation. "I think," he responded slowly. Victoria started gathering her paperwork. "The changeover will take effect right away. Your grandma knew this business that I was unaware of." Eleanor also asked me to remind everyone that Brit Holdings has always been successful due to meticulous preparation and attention to detail, not only charisma and vision. After all, even in death, Grandmother Ella Lehner had the last say. Everyone in the room knew that the Golden Boy's reign had ended before it had really begun because she had observed, assessed, and chosen competence over favoritism. The daughter who was supposed to help, not lead, was now in command of everything. Nathan's reputation in the business community and within the corporation collapsed in the months that followed the inheritance announcement. As soon as word got out that the heir apparent had been overlooked in favor of his ostensibly helpful sister, clients and rivals began to doubt every choice he had ever made. When reference checks exposed the real reasons behind his inheritance loss and the sequence of expensive errors that had persuaded his own grandmother to select his sister instead, his attempts to secure executive jobs elsewhere were repeatedly thwarted. When coworkers discovered that Richard's evaluation of his children's potential had been so seriously flawed that his own mother had felt obliged to step in from the grave, Richard was humiliated professionally and forced to confront decades of partiality that had almost completely destroyed the family business. As I looked over our most recent quarterly reports, which showed record profits under my direction, I thought about how Grandmother Ella Lehner's silent observation had validated years of unappreciated work and demonstrated that true leadership frequently comes from people who are preoccupied with finding solutions rather than taking credit. The ultimate confirmation that skill and commitment are more important than partiality and presumptive succession rights. The retribution I had unintentionally won was sweeter than anything I could have imagined.